to start with water language. So the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you all. Good morning, or I guess afternoon by now to all of you. Let me apologize first for the very simple diagrams, but I'll be using them to explain my points. I'm going to be going through three things today. The first is a brief history of the Indus Water Treaty, and an explanation or an overview of what it says in terms of the types of projects that we have between India and Pakistan. The second thing that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be walking through the Baglihar and Kishan-Ganga dispute and trying to explain to you the types of disputes that have arisen and the types of problems and the way we endeavor to answer them, because in essence they are to a certain extent engineering disputes. But even engineering disputes between top quality engineers wind up having to be litigated every once in a while, and then you get a perspective on how people are dealing with them. Now, let's begin first with the Indus Water Treaty. Pre-partition, and Rao Saab will obviously know more about this, even pre-partition, water was an issue between various provinces and states of India. So, for example, even as early as 1901, the Indian Irrigation Commission required Punjab to get permission from Sindh before making any projects. And there are various commissions appointed from time to time to deal with interprovincial grievances. There is the Cotton Commission of 1919, there is the Anderson Commission in 1935, and there is a Rao Commission in 1941, which is interesting in particular for those who are lawyers who are legally inclined, because it's a very good summary of international water law as it existed back then in 1940. Judge Rao subsequently also became a member of the International Court of Justice, and it's an extremely well-written thing. At the time of partition, no special arrangements were made by the Electoral Commission or any of by the British. The assumption was that the pre-existing arrangements would continue. This assumption was probably not particularly smart, but in any event, on 1st of April 1948, the Indian state of East Punjab cut off the flow in certain canals which came into Pakistan. Now, certain Indian scholars say that this is without the approval of the federal government, but it's unlikely. Whatever it was, on the 1st of April 1948, the water dispute between India and Pakistan started as we now know it. This flow is restored after a couple of months. And from the perspective of the Indians, it wasn't a big deal. Because 2 महीने के लिए थोड़ा सा पानी कम हो गया था. But if you want to understand India-Pakistan water relations, you have to look at it through the prism of this one incident. That is the moment that trust shattered. I mean, probably there wasn't much trust left after the events of partition, but in any event, in the specific context of water, every time Pakistan argues with India, we say, that's what you did. You want to understand the Indus Water Treaty, it is there to prevent that event from happening again. The provisions specifically that are under litigation are there to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And for example, when we were drafting the documents of pleadings in Baglihar, the point that we really try to get across is we have a history of mistrust. We don't like each other, it's unfortunate, but we don't trust Indians. And the reason why the Indus Water Treaty is as detailed from an engineering perspective as it is, it's because we don't trust them. We don't want them to have the capability to stop the water again and to put us in the position that we were back in 1948. Now, immediately after 1948, there is subsequently a Delhi Agreement of 4th of May 1948, and then subsequently Pakistan claimed that that agreement was coerced in the sense that we had no option but to sign it. And there is a fair amount of squabbling between the two countries. That squabbling goes over a period of time, and there are, some historians say that Pakistan was offered as many as 5 rivers back then in 1951-52. Gulati says that it wasn't a particularly serious sort of offer, but in any event, at that time, the perspective on the Indus Basin was that it would be a basin-wide sort of agreement. You're looking at existing principles of equitable usage. Pakistan's main point was that we wanted to preserve our historical usages and also wanted to get additional room to grow our historical usages. Because most of the irrigation network was in Pakistan, this was obviously a perspective which favored Pakistan. Then, as now, obviously the rivers went through India and Indian occupied Kashmir before coming to Pakistan. So India obviously wanted a different perspective in which they would be able to develop these areas to develop the irrigation. This sort of perspective or this sort of conclusion or discussion persists till about 1951. In 1951, there is somebody called David Lilienthal who comes to India and Pakistan, writes a very famous article in August 1951 in which he says essentially, look, India and Pakistan have just gone through partition, and if they don't figure out what they're going to do with their water issues, you're going to have another huge war between them. This is a giant problem. And based on his article, when the World Bank got involved, and the World Bank made a couple of fairly simple points. What they said was that given the amount of water in the Indus Basin, there was enough water for everybody. All that you needed to do was to figure out how to develop it cooperatively, and that this was essentially an engineering problem, not really a political one. It could be talked through. At that point, I didn't go very far again because neither side really trusted each other. In 1954, this is then formalized in the shape of a proposal from the World Bank president, Eugene Black. He talks about how you can have 3 rivers and 3 rivers. Even that then went on for a while, and there was a fair amount of discussion because Pakistan was talking, and rightly so, that it needed more storage space, and that storage space needed to be paid for, and we didn't have the money, etc. Things really changed in 1958 when the Ayub Khan comes, takes over power. The original coup, as you know, is 1956 by Iskandar Mirza. Ayub Khan takes over in 1958, and at that point, then he says, boom, this is the way it's going to be. And as we all know, Ayub Khan still gets a lot of flack for this in all of the history books. There are not that many great Pakistani books written on it, but one of the books which is written basically says something like, the standard narrative is that Ayub Khan ne mulk bhej diya, 3 darya de di. Now I'll come back to that in a minute, but the overall point at this moment in time was to figure out who's going to be paying for the storage costs, what kind of storage do you need, what kind of project will be, and who's going to be paying for this. Now, if somebody wants to do a thesis, the Pakistan Commissioner for Indus Water actually has all the archives of negotiations, and you can go through them. But the level of detail which they went to in negotiation is interesting. I mean, they even down to discussing as to how much sort of, earth can one donkey carry, how many donkeys are required, donkey ka kharcha kitna hai, etc., etc., etc. People did this in great detail. At that point, the working assumption was that India would not have actually any significant consumptive usages on Pakistan's rivers. This, by the time we reach a formal agreement or we're close to a formal agreement in 1960, India says, no, we want to have some consumptive usages as well. And at the very last second, this is then negotiated. Pakistan is obviously more desperate for water, therefore under more pressure. And Pakistan tried to compensate for its position by saying, okay, if you're going to have certain usages, if you're going to have, for example, hydroelectric usages and certain minimal consumptive usages, we will specify everything. We will go into the nitty-gritty of the design of each and every project, where the gates are to be located, where the sediment outlet is to be located. Each and every point will be from the perspective of trying to minimize India's control over the river. Now, that is in the case of, you can see, this is the treaty. I've got it with me. Actually, we have an original as well in the office, which is very rare because my partner's grandfather was one of the representatives. So we're one of, I think, other than the government of Pakistan, the only other people in Pakistan who have, as you can see, it's basically a book. And the technical aspects of the treaty are dealing with run-of-river projects are in Next D, which is another 4 or 5 pages in itself. So there's a fair amount of detail there, but obviously you can't do everything in advance. Now, let me ask a question here quickly. If Pakistan got 3 rivers and India got 3 rivers, what percentage of the water of the basin did we get?
67.
No. Anybody else? 375 and 80. So the next time somebody writes that Ayub Khan ne 3 darya de diye, you need to be able to respond to them and say कि 3 darya इसलिए दिए थे क्योंकि जब आपको 5 darya दिए थे तो आपने दिए नहीं थे, और 3 darya में भी आपको 75 से 80% मिल गए थे. This isn't really my area in that sense because it was discussed, but the question was asked in a general sense, like why do we have a situation where projects which are engineeringly blindingly obvious, like the Kalabagh Dam, don't get bid? They don't get built because there are trust issues. They don't get built because you don't trust your institutions, as is pointed out. Because you don't trust your institutions, therefore everybody who's out there making a decision wants to make sure that he's not put in a position where he's questioned afterwards. So the only way that you can be put in a position where you're not questioned afterwards is if you get 120% out of the 100 assigned. That's not the way that deals are made. Ayub Khan made a good deal. I don't think he could have made a better deal at that moment in time. He secured Pakistan's water future. आज तक उसको गालियां पड़ती हैं. सारे लोग जो हैं वो कहते हैं कि अयूब खान ने ये कर दिया, वो कर दिया. लोगों को ये भी नहीं पता कि 75 से 80% पानी ले लिया. Why then do you excoriate him? The person who says that Kalabar Dam is impossible, रुक जाएंगे, बर्बाद हो जाएंगे, even though it is physically impossible for the water to go upstream and flood Bushera, is going to be a popular hero. The person who says it's technically impossible will be told that he doesn't know anything about science. This is the way your politics operates. But it's not just because we're corrupt, it's because you're corrupt, because you don't have trust in the system, therefore you're always trying to protect yourself. That's the way that cycle works. So the Indus Water Treaty, fortunately, is one of those few instances where somebody had sufficient power, sufficient guts, and sufficient belief in himself to say, fine, I take a decision, मुझे गालियां दे देना, कम से कम कुछ ना कुछ तो बच जाएगा. You made a decision, you got what you could, and as Feisal again pointed out, it's important that you take a decision. Sometimes even a bad decision is better than no decision. Hence the saying that the best is the enemy of the good. You can keep on asking for the best, you won't get it. Take what you can. That's politics. Politics is reality. Now, between 1960 and roughly, let's say, the year 2002, 2003, the Indus Water Treaty is very sleeping. I mean, nothing really happens. There's an Indus Water Commissioner, there's a Pakistan Commissioner for Indus Water, there's an Indian Commissioner for Indus Water. They meet once a year, sometimes twice a year, they write letters to each other. India would propose something, we would object, and everything would stop. Nothing would happen. So India proposed the Wular Barrage in, I think, early 80s. We objected, that got suspended, went to the composite dialogue, hasn't moved since. India proposed the Salal Dam. Salal Mein, there was a low-level outlet for sediment. We objected, they closed it. Subsequently, the Salal project, which if you ever get to see, is basically a giant pool of mud. So India wasn't very happy about it. In the early 2000s, India decided at some point, and it's evident only in retrospect, they said that we're going to push ahead. We're not going to wait for Pakistani objections to get resolved. Under the process prescribed in the treaty, India has to give you 6 months notice of their design before they start construction. We are given 6 months to object. The treaty doesn't say that India is supposed to resolve Pakistan's objections before starting construction, even though, hold on a second, that's Pakistan's official position. I think that's a very optimistic interpretation of the treaty, but let's see how that works. So, until about 2002, 2003, it really wasn't much of an issue. Baudelaire is proposed originally in 94, and it becomes a hot legal issue in 2004. Kishanganga is proposed in 96, doesn't really become a hot legal issue until 2003, and suddenly the Indians put on the accelerator and say, now we want to go ahead with it. Okay. What I'm now going to do is to walk you through the legal issues, or the engineering/legal issues which happened. This is not going to be an earth-shattering thing, it's just going to give you a better understanding of the issues of the Indus Water Treaty and how they're being discussed and debated. This is a very rough sketch of the Baudelaire Dam. Okay, I'm just trying to explain what the issues are. It's on the Chenab. It's a 450 megawatt project. It's a 144 meter dam, high dam wall. Maximum design discharge was 16,500 cumecs, which is a good chunk of water. This is the important point. There are 5 spillway gates. Okay, they're over here, but they're below the water level. If you look at it from the side, it'll make a bit more sense. This is roughly where the water is coming out from. This is the dead storage level. That at top FPL is full pondage level. Now, Pakistan's basic problem with this project is that anything what the treaty says is if you're going to have spillway gates, then the bottom level, and if you can't have an ungated spillway, then that needs to be as high as possible. The reason you have similar provisions for sediment control outlets. if you need a sediment control outlet, that outlet needs to be as high and as small as possible. The reason why it's there is because that outlet obviously controls all the water. So if you think of it in simple terms, if you have an outlet here, that means you can empty the dam all the way down till here. If you don't have an outlet, if you only have an ungated spillway, then the water flows over the top, so you can't control it at all. It's like a giant bathtub. If there's a plunger at the bottom, आप उसको खाली कर सकते हैं, and then you can fill it up. And while you're filling it up, no water flows downstream. If the tub is only something that you can fill once you fill, then that's it. There's nothing else you can do. So that was the basic idea behind the treaty. कि जो plug का, जो bathtub का जो outlet होगा, that will be as high as possible and as small as possible. So that was the basic point in the treaty, and this is stated in 5 different ways in paragraph 8 of Annexure D to the treaty. The further point was, and this is something that at the time when India started pushing for the Baglihar project, is that they also announced a whole bunch of other projects. So there was going to be a cascade of projects, something like 20 different projects on the various rivers which are flowing through Indian occupied Kashmir. So you could have water going through one project, you'll be stopped there, then it flows into the next project, which is also empty, stopped there. So between that, you could do an immense amount of damage to Pakistan. And the Indians keep on saying that we're suspicious, and we keep on saying, we have this treaty for a reason because we don't trust you. So that was the dialogue which was happening when the Baglihar case was being discussed. Pakistan, under the treaty, there are 2 types of dispute resolution mechanisms. For technical issues, you have a neutral expert. For all other issues, you have what's called a court of arbitration, which is made up of 7 people. At that time, the thinking in Pakistan was this is a purely engineering issue. So we will go to the World Bank, get a neutral expert, and he give a decision in our favor. There were 3 names proposed by the World Bank. We agreed to 2, Indians agreed to 1. That one person was Professor Raymond Lafitte of Switzerland, and Pakistan said, yeah, fine, we go ahead. In retrospect, not such a good idea. Raymond Lafitte, lovely guy, I had the chance to work with him, but he's from Switzerland. What's the important point of Switzerland from a water rights perspective? Anyone? It's upstream from everybody. They're an upper riparian. They don't know what your problem is. You're a downstream riparian. You're possibly paranoid, possibly justifiably so, but you're downstream. The Swiss guy thinks everything is milk and honey. What does the Swiss guy do? He designs large dams. This is what he does for a living. He's an engineer. He's a good engineer, but all he does is figure out how to build large dams. If you try to tell him not to build a large dam because you're a downstream riparian and you're nervous, you pick the wrong guy. Notwithstanding that, and this is what Pakistan went through, and this is the process that we adopted. In the context of Baglihar, there were actually 5 issues. The first was freeboard. Freeboard is the level of the dam which is on top of FPL. The point that we were making is that if you close the gates, then this bit which is on top of the full pondage level can be used to store water and it's excess storage. The second point that we made was that the design flood that the Indians had given was far too big, and therefore again was being used to have excess capacity which they could abuse. The third was that the pondage given in the project, which is this area, which is the active amount. The dam is never supposed to be emptied below dead storage level. Full pondage level is the maximum. That's the variable amount in there, and I'll explain what it's there for. Then there was an issue with respect to the power intakes, which I'll come back to, and the final issue was that of the spillway gates. As I explained, freeboard is the amount of the concrete wall on top of the dam, which is there to prevent waves from splashing over. That's a pure engineering issue. So eventually, and one of the things which everybody worked out when we went through the first Baglihar case was that basically the Indians were rigging it too. I mean, you went through this process, we go through it, and you like, you know, Indians हैं on central water, ये वो खाना बड़ी तैयारी की होगी. It doesn't quite work that way. They were also sort of, you know, a lot of times they had not done their homework. One, at the end of this, and in the context of sediment, the Indian Water Secretary said कि हमें पहले पता होता तो ये हम बनाते हैं, but आपको बन गया. So what the engineering calculations for freeboard showed was that they had given, I think, 3 meters or 4.5 meters at that point in time. When we eventually asked them for their calculations, they gave their calculations, it turned out that in order for them to have a wave that high in a 33-kilometer long reservoir, you needed to have simultaneously hurricane force winds and a, I think, 5-level earthquake. So we pointed out that those two things were unlikely at the same time, and the neutral expert agreed, which is why it was reduced. That's the kind of stuff which happens from engineering perspective. That was fairly simple. The second point was maximum design flood. From an engineering perspective, the issue was that you design, this is the maximum amount of flood which can come in a river at any point in time. The whole, from an engineering perspective, from a design perspective, what we need is essentially the ability to discharge that flood without the thing falling apart. So the way you figure out traditionally कि ये maximum design flood कितना होता है, as you look at your precipitation charts, कि कितनी बारिश हुई, कितना फ्लड पहले आया, एंड फ्रॉम दैट यू गो ओके, अगर पिछले 100 साल में जो आपके पास रिकॉर्ड्स हैं, अगर इतना फ्लड आया तो 1000 साल में इतना आ जाएगा, 10,000 साल में इतना आ जाएगा. That was, so obviously when you're extrapolating from limited data, somebody has a line which goes like this and somebody has a line which goes like this. That's what the debate was. The Swiss expert said, well, why don't you take a completely different approach, which is to say you figure out this is the catchment area, this is your probable amount of rain, and you figure out the amount, but his basic response was, look, even if you say this is too big, there is no harm done. अगर बड़ा फ्लड आ जाएगा तो आपका डैम टूट जाएगा, अगर छोटा होगा तो किसी को नहीं पता. And what do you know with the black swan event? Could be anything. Patterson didn't get very far on that one. Point number 3 was pondage, as I said. Now this is one of the issues on which the treaty is actually confusing as all hell. Which is odd, because there were very high-level engineers who worked on this. And you have 2 very, very precise definitions in the treaty, which are added into a third one, which doesn't make any sense. What's the first precise definition? There's minimum mean discharge. You take over a certain period of years, the minimum discharges in each year, you work out the mean of those discharges, and that's a sort of, मतलब कि जो सर्दियों में भी सबसे कम पानी you're likely to get. So it's the minimum mean discharge for the winter amount. That amount of water, when it goes through the project, yields a certain amount of power. That's called firm power. यानी कि और कुछ हो ना हो, you are 99% certain कि इतनी तो बिजली आपको मिलेगी. Then the treaty says that you can have twice the pondage required for firm power. Nobody knows what the hell that means. This is what's pondage. Pondage is the amount of water that you get to meet fluctuations in load. Okay. So what you wind up with is, from an engineering perspective, there are 2 ways to look at it. The way is that one is that you keep the output constant. अगर output constant है तो फिर आपको पानी की कितनी variation चाहिए to get that. That was the Pakistan approach. You said it's pondage required for firm power, and that means you have constant output. So you have a certain amount of water in there, and you figure out the variability. Now the problem is that minimum mean is already pretty much low. उसमें variability बहुत कम होती है. Essentially next to no variability. So आप double भी कर दो तो next to no variability, double is still a very, very small number. The Indians did the exact opposite. What they said is कि आप minimum mean discharge अगर आ रहे हैं और हमने अपनी मर्जी की बिजली जनरेट करनी है तो फिर हम क्या करेंगे? So they took the input as a given and the output they wanted to have a certain fluctuating sort of, they said कि हमारा load curve जो होगा हम उसके मुताबिक बिजली बनाएंगे. The further problem on that is that if you look at the Indus Water Treaty, there are certain locations, जैसे जैसे आप लाइन ऑफ कंट्रोल के करीब आते हैं तो आपकी डिस्चार्ज वेरिएबिलिटी कम कर देते हैं. So at bare minimum, जिधर भी हो project on the Chenab, you have, for example, week to week constant flow. India can make any project The amount of water coming in 1 week has to equal the amount of water going out. Below X and above Y, the amount of water can't be more than 130%, less than 70%. This is where this project is located. And if you are even closer to the line of control, then it's a 24-hour cycle. The amount of money coming in, the amount of water coming in has to equal 1. So between all of these, the question was, kya karna hai? The Indian load curve also didn't make any sense. As you guys know, generally hydroelectric projects are used for peaking because you can ramp it up very quickly and use thermal for base load. So load curve में अगर आपको peaking purposes के लिए अगर आपको ये hydel power चाहिए, you're going to peak when? Normally you use peak electricity in the evening or in the morning. What the Indians had was you were peaking at 4 in the morning because they were working backwards from how to get the maximum amount of water in there. Anyway, how did it all get resolved? The neutral expert again wasn't particularly impressed. He said, look, you either have a very small number or a very, very small number. And what he said is, I take the load curve for the standard Indian northern grid, और उसके मुताबिक उसने जो है ना वो बना दिया है. This is now again a point of dispute, still from Pakistan's perspective, but that's what happened. There was again issue in relation to the power. Power gates में issue ये होता है कि अगर आप where the water goes into the turbines, if that intake is too close to the surface, then what happens is the little swirls of air go in, the air bubbles go in and they mess up your turbines because sort of cavitation, to use a technical thing. So it needs to be below a certain amount. There are certain formulas that you apply. People applied the formulas, we disagreed. The neutral expert applied the formula, was roughly the same thing, no big deal. The number one issue, and this is where the engineering really came in, and this is where I said the Indians hadn't done their homework, was in terms of sediment control and in terms of spillway gates. As I said, the spillway gates are over there and sort of below the water level. The treaty has two separate provisions which were applicable. One says that the gates which are for discharge of the water, the spillway gates have to be, it should be ungated if possible. And if it can't be ungated, then the bottom edge of the gate should be as high as possible. There is a separate provision dealing with sediment control, which says that if you have something for sediment control, it should be as small and as high as possible. Now, पहले तो पाकिस्तान कह रहा था कि हमारे पास ungated spillway होनी चाहिए because you can make one, etc. That got shot down on day one before anybody said anything. The neutral expert came in and he said, ungated spillway will be monstrous. Like, literally, we had plans and everything was like, इसको side पे रखते. उसने पहले दिन, without looking at anything, this is not working. So then Pakistan put in a huge amount of effort to show the different types of spillway options that we have. We were essentially pushing for gates, but surface gated ones, because again that provides less control. India's argument was कि जो आप gates जो हैं, the modern design technology is that you have sediment control and flood control all in the same thing. And our answer was, in essence, we don't care what modern design says. This is the treaty. We have the treaty because we don't like you, we don't trust you. It's not a nice way to make an argument, but that's the practical point. The treaty exists for a purpose, your design we don't care about. What it further came down to is that there is a specific provision. What we did then after that is, first we did an analysis of sediment to figure out कि इससे फर्क क्या पड़ेगा. Because as again Raj Saab would know, the sediment load in Chenab is huge. If you don't control it, not only is your reservoir going to fill up, but it's going to mess up your turbines. Now, you have to step back for a minute and think. In the Pakistan context, a reservoir filling up with sediment is a tragedy. In the context of the Indus Water Treaty and the Run River project, the reservoir filling up with sediment is not a big deal. The reservoir is not there for water control purposes. The only amount that we're using is pondage. As long as your pondage isn't really affected, and as long as your peaking ability remains the same, you don't really care. So reservoir control, we said, is not a big deal. The only issue is control of preventing ingress of sediment or rough sediment into the power intake. And in that context, the further point that we made, well, neutral expert didn't agree with us. He said, no, reservoir control is also an issue. Now, sediment control in reservoirs takes place in one of two ways, basically. One is called sluicing, the other is called flushing. Sluicing means कि जो आपका sediment road जो गर्मियों में आता है, उसको आप basically गुजार देते हैं. It comes and you just basically pass it through, so you reduce the amount of sediment which is deposited in the reservoir. It doesn't actually get rid of whatever you have. Flushing or drawdown flushing is a different technique. What you do is you reduce the water level and it becomes a river again to a certain extent, and it scours away the sediment and essentially cleans what you have there. The problem from the Indian perspective is that the treaty says in express terms that you can't lower the water level below dead storage level for operational purposes. So पहले तो हमारी बहस ये हुई थी कि यार if you can't do this, and the Indians kept on saying ठीक है हम मानते हैं हम नहीं कर सकते, but even with that these low level gates will do something really useful. And our engineering response was no it won't. If you keep the water level high and you have low level gates, your low level gates will maybe clear out about 20 meters of a 33 kilometer long reservoir, and your gates are, your power intake is 60 meters away, तो उसको तो कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा. So if it makes no difference, then you have to move your gates up. That was the entire argument that happened. And at that point, this is where, as I said, the Indian water sector, nobody had done any detailed studies at that point in time. We went to India, we looked at the way they had carried out a physical study. उन्होंने उसका बनाया हुआ था कि नहीं ये बगलिहार क्या है. And there was a sediment study which consisted of, and I'm not joking, I saw this with my own eyes, कि वो sort of model बना हुआ है ये sort of उसका बेसिन का जो बगलिहार क्या है. उसके ऊपर एक फट्टा है, उसके ऊपर धोती वाला बाबा जो है ना वो रेत लेके यूं करके फिरता है. This was the scientific method that they had, and जो हमारा scientific expert था, the American, he basically keeled over के ये कर क्या रहे? You can't predict a damn thing from this. So then both sides hired very high level sort of computer guys who did computer studies of how sedimentation would work, spent a lot of money, and at that point India had been saying that with their sediment control method, with no drawdown, they had 30 years of operation. After they did the computer studies, they figured out it would be 6 years. That's when their water secretary said, yeah, if I had known this, yes, we probably wouldn't have built it, but they did. Anyway, so we were fairly confident because we thought that we had proven that this would work. At that point, the draft decision came down, and in the draft decision, the neutral expert said, what Pakistan says is technically correct, but I still think the dam is okay. So we went to that if it's technically, if it makes no difference, then you can look at this. This is available, I think, in the World Bank archives. If it makes no difference, then you have to give us, you have to tell them to move the gates. What is this? So at that point, India came up with a new argument saying that the limitation on drawdown for operational purposes doesn't affect maintenance. And they said, look, it doesn't say anything about, it doesn't restrict maintenance. And the neutral expert sort of seized on this as if it was, like somebody drowning and said, fine, take care of basis पे उसने final decision कर दिया कि the treaty prevents drawdown for operational purposes, not for maintenance purposes. और हम पिटते रह गए कि जी maintenance का लफ्ज़ इस्तेमाल ही नहीं हुआ पूरी treaty में, आप कहाँ से निकाल रहे हैं? Okay. That was engineering perspective one. At that point, we now come into the realm of law. We were, from Pakistan's perspective, the question was, what do we do next? So let me give you a brief overview of the Kishan-Ganga dispute. Blue line is the Neelam river, which is called Kishan-Ganga in India. That white line, this is the line of control. It crosses the line of control, comes down. The Kishan-Ganga project basically diverts water down here to Budar Lake, and then the Jhelum goes back to Muzaffarabad. This dotted line is the Neelam-Jhelum project in Pakistan. So our point is that the water that you divert basically is going to mess up our project. And roughly at that point with a 16% average annual loss, 33% in winters, 10% in summer. So this was originally, actually this started, the problem, the dispute started before Baghyar, but then the Indians changed the design again, so it got put on the back burner. The difference between the two projects is that the Neelam River has essentially next to no sediment control. Our analysis is that even if you do nothing for sediment control, This project will operate possibly for minimum of 80 years and probably for the rest of its eternity without any sediment control measures because उसमें मिट्टी होती नहीं है. That's why it's called Neelam. It's Neelam, right? So what the Indians had done is उन्होंने मक्की पे मक्की मारी थी. Their standard design, low-level outlets, large outlets, is taken from the other side, Nepal side, where they actually used them. They had taken it, they had plonked it on the western rivers, Pakistan, where there are operational restrictions, and now they were applying it on a river where actually it made no sense whatsoever. So we had two options legally. Option number one was we could try and appeal the Baghliar verdict to the Court of Arbitration. Or what we could do is we could take the same question regarding drawdown flushing and put it in a different context of Kishanganga. And we thought we would be likely to win that because Kishanganga mein to aapko zarurat hi nahi hai. When you look at a question, context matters, perspective matters, comparison matters. If I have to defend the Baghliar decision, it's practical. Baghliar can't operate without sediment control. It's a $4 billion project or something like that. $4 अरब जो है, आप उठा के फेंक रहे हो क्यों वरना 6 साल में चीज बंद हो जाएगी. As opposed to Kishanganga, where they are making an idiotic argument from a technical perspective, because you don't actually need it. So that decision was taken from a strategic perspective that Baghliar was essentially a lost cause. What we would try and do is we would isolate this as a legal argument. We would try and win it in the context of Kishanganga and then apply it back to Baghliar. That's basically what happened. So 2 points were isolated in the context of Kishanganga. One is the issue of diversion, and the other was the issue of drawdown flushing. So Pakistan went to a 7-member court of arbitration and argued that, and we won the drawdown flushing completely. There they said कि ये तो हो ही नहीं सकता. जो neutral expert ने जो distinction निकाली है between operational and maintenance actually makes no sense whatsoever. The trickier part was diversion. Now, apart from the reason why it's tricky is because in Annexure D to the treaty, in paragraph 15, it says you can't do anything like this except from one tributary of the Jhelum to another one. So there is a very specific clause saying you can divert in these circumstances which applies directly to these facts. Now this is written in 1960, so obviously somebody had some idea that this was coming along. You have to give it some meaning. So if you're Pakistan, this is there, how are you going to defend it? Well, first of all, it's not an absolute right. What it said was that as long as it doesn't affect the then existing agricultural or hydroelectric usages. Now, agricultural usages को तो कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता because if you've seen the Neelam Valley is mostly sort of it's V-shaped. So नीचे पानी होता है और ऊपर जो होता है ना फिर there are these terraces or whatever else that you use. To the extent that you have a small degree of lift pumps or people using water in that, it's minor. And in any event, जो पानी divert होता है, I think कुछ 6-8 kilometer after crossing the line of control, you have other tributaries come in and basically वो पानी फिर से शुरू हो जाता है. So that was a problem. The agricultural uses basically आपके कोई इतने खास you weren't able to prove. So we claimed obviously a fair amount, but we had trouble proving that. The second issue was downstream effect on Neelam Jhelum. Now Neelam Jhelum had technically been underway since 1988, but as we do with everything else, वो उसको लेके बैठे रहे, until ultimately it started almost simultaneously with the Kishanganga project. Kishanganga was proposed in 96, Neelam Jhelum in 88. Both of them were dead projects for a while. Both of them then restarted. The question was who restarted first. And on that point, the Court of Arbitration ruled against Pakistan and said India committed to its project before Pakistan committed to its project. We think that was wrong, they ignored certain evidence, but in any event, that was their finding. We had one alternate argument, in fact, two alternate arguments that we developed. The first alternate argument was that this is, when you say the then existing, that's a continuous obligation. So, अगर मैं पानी इस्तेमाल नहीं कर रहा तो इंडिया ले सकता है. If I'm not using the water, then India can take it. But as and when I need the water, you give it back to me. And there was some precedent. There are these the Helsinki rules which came out in 2006, which no, there is the Berlin route of 2002 or 3, which expand upon the Helsinki route of 1956, in which this point is sort of brought about. And we tried very hard, but essentially the Court of Arbitration said that's a cute argument, but not quite good enough. Since I came up with the argument, I'm very attached to it, but koi baat nahi. The second argument was environmental. And this was interesting because Pakistan in the Neelam-Jhelum project is also had not taken environmental norms into account. But we thought this was a better argument now at this point in time to argue that if you're going to divert the water, you will then destroy the environmental integrity of the river itself. Winter flows at the point of diversion are roughly, we had very limited data, but let's say somewhere between 10 and 20 cubics, probably closer to about 15. The diversion capacity is 98 cubics. So for 6 months of the year, probably more 6 to 7 months, there would be no water going in that river whatsoever because it diverts just before the line of control. And immediately after the line of control, over here, up here, when it crosses, this is a national park. So we were trying to make an environmental/emotional argument that we have a national park there, and this is going to be destroyed, and it's going to look terrible. And the argument was being made that you needed to preserve the environmental integrity of the river. And on that we did get some traction. What the tribunal did, what the Court of Arbitration did, it says that environmental norms have to be read into the Indus Water Treaty so that you have to interpret the treaty in accordance with international law norms. Perhaps one of the reasons that it did was that Pakistan was smart enough to nominate Judge Bruno Sima of the International Court of Justice, who is very famous for his case, the Iron Rhine case, in which he made a similar argument in an international context. But that's what we were trying to get. On that basis, we got certain minimum flows, which were a lot more than the Indians were proposing, and that has reduced the quantum of diversion and given us reduced our. So instead of average annual loss of 16%, we're going to get average annual loss of something like 10%, which is still significant. On the right side, we are now proposing another project over here. ये नीलम-झेलम है. So इसमें यहाँ से पानी कम हो गया, but we've got another project which goes roughly from here to here. That's Kohala, I think, which is hopefully going to give us back that water. Now, this is, as I said, this was a pretty good decision. The bigger point, as I said, was that of drawdown flushing. They have given a clear decision in Pakistan's favor, and the Indians have, however, refused to change their design on that basis, which is why Pakistan is now going back to the Court of Arbitration or the neutral expert and seeking an implementation of that decision in terms of the actual design of the Indus Water River. We also want a definitive answer on the question of pondage, which will show up once in a while. But if we succeed in having the design of Kishanganga changed, that means that this is a change that India has to make for every single project that it is designing in Indian occupied Kashmir. So it is a very significant thing, but we are fairly confident because if you can't justify the design on the basis of sediment control, then there is no other ground that you can justify it on. So that's my overview of these two judgments, these pending cases in the Indus Water Treaty. If anybody has any further questions, I'm open to them. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, number one, the decision by the Court of Arbitration is a general legal decision, so it affects every single project except Bagihar. वो पुराना उन्होंने exempt कर दिया. In the future, or every other project under construction is basically affected by what they have decided. So Bagihar itself is exempt, but if you can't draw down the water level at any point in time, then India will still have a problem because it will still fill up with mud. And they won't be able to do much about it. And maybe 10 साल में उसका खास रहेगा नहीं कोई फर्क उसमें. In terms of the process itself, I think what this taught me is that India-Pakistan की dispute जो है, you need an external person to tell you what you're doing. And the first time the Kishanganga design was proposed, there were only 2 spillway gates. And India has a safety thing which says that you have to come up with the size of the gates has to be worked out to discharge X, Y, Z, assuming one gate is stuck. So we did our engineers did the math and they came back and said, ये तो उनका design, ये तो उनका safety standard fail हो जाता है. So we raised this point and the engineer was like, no it doesn't. Like, look, it's a math issue. Do the math. One gate is stuck. This is your safety standard. एक gate बंद है, एक gate खुला है, इतना पानी आ रहा, you can't discharge it without your dam failing. Like, no, it's not. Okay. So 6 महीने बाद we meet again. They say we've changed it for our own reasons. It has nothing to do with safety standard X, Y, Z. Yeah. Well, that's what happened. Everything became, you needed somebody to point out the basic facts of life to you. And India has a minor problem of the minor case of what we have as a major case, which is that you need to be able to make sensible decisions without people accusing you of being a traitor. In the context of Kalabagh, the story that I've heard is that Liaquat Jatoi was willing to sort of agree to certain things. And then he said, I can't do it because when I go back to Sindh, I'll get lynched. So it's not, if you create a situation where it's impossible to give a straight reply, because कल को किसी ने उठा के आपको जेल में डाल देना है, तो आप किस तरह किसी से बात करोगे? Even straightforward engineering issues become completely politicized. You can't have a rational conversation on this because if you have a rational conversation, somebody tomorrow is going to say, "Hey, आपने तो ये किया था." I was on Twitter the other day and I made some comment about Imran Khan, and somebody wrote that Feisal Naqvi, he lost us to Baghliar case. He has no credibility. I mean, I was number 5 in a team of 5 lawyers. But I am very grateful if you think I was that important. But you know, whoa, Kana. This still happens to Ayub Khan. We thought, so many people think that the Indus Water Treaty is terrible, except when the Indians try and get rid of it. Then it's the best thing possible.
But we people criticize Ayub Khan only on account of data storage facility of Western River to India, not on the whole Indus property. Due to this storage facility, India is building a survey dam, and on the other hand, non-technical, non-professional people could not bear the Indian motive at that time. That's the reason.
So storage facilities, India hasn't constructed any so far. Every single project so far is a run-of-river project. Storage facilities,
how small is small?
There are physical limitations. आप देख रहे TT में, there are express limitations thereon. In fact, it's actually scary that India hasn't built any storage facility because तब आपको असल मसला पड़ेगा. They don't have enough they don't need it there for their limited purposes. But when they start doing it just to do something to you, yes, then it is a problem. But you don't get 100% win all the time. Overall, look at the good that the Indus Water Treaty has done. आपकी कितनी जंगें होगी उनके साथ? कभी पानी बंद हुआ नहीं. So you got what you wanted, and you got, most importantly, you got something that the Indians cannot terminate, and beyond that, you have an international mechanism which the Indians are obliged to respect. They can't turn around and say कि हम court of arbitration का फैसला नहीं मानते. You can't. There is no other context in which you have that, which is equally important.
In implementation aspects of the treaty, Article 9, after arbitration and expert opinion, then what about the implementation? India is bound to implement?
Yes. In theory, India can simply say, "हम नहीं मानते." But given India's status in the world today, they don't realistically have the option of saying that they won't accept what the treaty says. That's why they can't abrogate it. Technically, they can simply unilaterally announce that we don't accept this treaty. But that's not the way international law works. They are bound by it. And they have repeatedly stated in all of these decisions that जो फैसला होगा उसको they will honor. Sir. Correct. So the effects are one time. time the reservoir is filled.
There's a question, like will it affect the time of availability of water to in your agriculture system, or what type of?
So there are number one, it's only a one-time issue because आप एक दफा जब भर लेते हैं तो फिर खत्म हो जाता है इशू. उसके बाद फॉर एग्जाम्पल this is filled up once. So once this is filled up, only this amount, this isn't to scale. I mean, this is much less. So there isn't that much water which is actually used, so it doesn't affect your storage, your flows that much. But because there are two protections in the treaty which says that because of the location, jitna pani aata hai, for example, if you get, let's assume 100 cumecs, then you have to release a minimum of 70 cumecs and a maximum of 130, so your flow doesn't become too dysynchronized. Secondly, even in terms of filling, there are specific time periods which are provided in the treaty if you haven't had a bilateral agreement. What happened in the case of Baglihar is that the Indians actually filled it up at the wrong time because Manmohan Singh was coming to inaugurate the Baglihar project, and you can see there is a flow and suddenly goes like this. And Pakistan objected, and they're like, that's natural variation, but there's nothing we could really realistically do at that point in time. But it's a one-time problem. Once it's filled up, then they are required to make sure that the flows stay within certain boundaries. This is a win-win. They make electricity, there's minimal storage, and we get the full use of the water, consumptive usage. इससे ज़्यादा win-win और क्या होगा? उनको बिजली मिल रही है, हमें usage मिल रहा है.
Timing issue.
They are not allowed to, as I said, mess with the timing of the water. The timing is protected if, depending upon where the project is located. On an upstream, on a project which is far away from the line of control, the quantum of water which comes in within 7 days has to be released within 7 days. So it's 1 week sort of constant. If you are closer to the line of control, and particularly on the Chenab, then there are limitations. For example, अगर 100 cubic आ रहा है, तो within 1 day you can release maximum of 130, a minimum of 70. And if you are even closer to the line of control, then it's a 24-hour cycle. So जितना पानी 24 घंटे में आता है, उतना ही पानी आगे जाता है. So you can't mess with timing either.
As it was said by the court of that the Indus project is less in the projects are environmental flow. Why we could not say about the Eastern River about this? That minimum environmental flow should be there also in the Eastern River.
You can try, but your problem is that because those rivers are assigned entirely to India, it's for India to decide whether or not it wants to give up an environmental flow or not. Trying to read an environmental flow into the eastern rivers is going to be tough because the treaty is pretty clear that those are India's rivers to do with as it wants. At that time, you're right, perhaps notions of environmental flow weren't as clear. Perhaps they should have been there, but they didn't. But from a practical perspective, if you start getting into measuring of environmental flow, तो फिर तो मसले पड़ते हैं.
If they are the signatory of certain protocol and conventions, they can.
The protocols are different from a treaty which is binding and which has a enforcement mechanism. A lot of protocols are sort of like more like sort of polite wishes. Yes, we need to have an agreement with them as well. But the problem with international water law is that it's really vague. If you don't have a treaty, then you're talking about things like equitable uses, and equitable uses can mean anything. Equity is the eye of the beholder. Very subjective. So unless they are completely diverting the water, you really can't say anything. They can say we are poorer, we need the water more. So it makes sense for you to sit down and have a binding agreement with Afghanistan.
I guess we have to disperse for lunch as well. But thank you, Faisal, for that very excellent. A couple of more announcements. So those of you who are registered for the for the school, you have to mark your attendance at the registration desk post lunch and before you come for the lecture afterwards. And also, I've made that up. I guess that's the only announcement. So we'll meet at 2 in the same auditorium.